In November 1991, the world stood still when Earvin "Magic" Johnson announced he was retiring from the Lakers effective immediately. We all remember the press conference, the somber faces, and the terrifying diagnosis that felt like a death sentence at the time. But fast forward to today, and Magic Johnson is 67 years old, standing at a crossroads that no one, not even his doctors, ever predicted he would reach. Recent sightings of the NBA legend have sparked a wave of concern and disbelief, leaving fans asking, how did the man who cheated death for 3 decades suddenly end up here? What you're about to see isn't just a health update. It's a revelation about the heavy price of survival that Magic has been hiding behind that famous smile. There are moments in history that don't just stop a room, they stop a generation. November 7, 1991. Los Angeles. A press conference that no one in that room was prepared for. Earvin "Magic" Johnson, the most electric smile in professional basketball, the man who made the Los Angeles Lakers feel like a religion, walked up to a cluster of microphones and told the world something that nobody had the vocabulary to process. He was HIV-positive. And just like that, the clock started ticking. Now, you have to understand the context of that moment in time. In 1991, an HIV diagnosis wasn't just a medical verdict. For most people, it was a death sentence. Full stop, no appeal, no second chapter. The medical community was still scrambling. Treatments were brutal, experimental, and largely ineffective for long-term survival. AIDS had already swallowed entire communities. It had taken Rock Hudson. It was taking thousands of others whose names the world would never know. And now, here was Magic Johnson, the most alive person any sports fan had ever watched, telling them that the countdown had begun. What the cameras captured that day was the press conference. What they didn't capture was everything happening behind closed doors. Magic has spoken in fragments about this over the years, but the complete picture is something he has carefully guarded. The private terror. The nights when Cookie Johnson sat beside him and neither of them could sleep because the silence felt like a rehearsal for something permanent. The conversations with his children that he didn't know how to finish. The phone calls from doctors who were choosing their words so carefully that the carefulness itself was the most frightening thing of all. And then there was the medication. The drug regimen that Magic Johnson began in 1991 and has maintained for over 30 years is, by any medical standard, extraordinary. The antiretroviral therapy that kept him alive was cutting edge for its era, and Magic, with his resources and his determination, had access to the best of it. He became, in many ways, a living clinical trial. His team of specialists monitored him more closely than almost any private patient in medical history. Every adjustment to his treatment was a high-stakes calculation. Push too hard in one direction and you risk organ stress. Ease back and the virus finds a window. For the first decade, it was about survival. Pure and simple. For the second decade, it became something else. It became the miracle story. Magic Johnson was not just alive, he was thriving. He was building businesses, making television appearances, buying sports franchises. He was living the kind of life that made his doctors quietly shake their heads in something that looked a lot like disbelief. They had given him projections. He had ignored every single one of them. But here is what almost no one talks about. The medications that saved Magic Johnson's life are powerful in ways that go far beyond what most people understand. Decades of antiretroviral therapy, decades of chemical intervention at the cellular level, creates a biological reality that modern medicine is only beginning to fully document. Long-term survivors of HIV who have been on sustained treatment regimens are now living long enough to present with health complications that the medical world never had the data to predict. Because not enough people survived long enough for doctors to study what happens next. Magic Johnson is, in a very real and sobering sense, medical territory that science is still mapping in real time. And as he turned 65, then 66, and now stands at 67 years old, the cumulative weight of 30-plus years of pharmaceutical management of a chronic, systemic condition has started to manifest in ways that even his closest medical team did not fully anticipate. The clock didn't stop when Magic survived. It just started counting something different. And what it has been counting toward, the thing that his family is now grappling with behind closed doors, is exactly what we are going to unpack in the chapters ahead. Because the story of Magic Johnson at 67 is not the story of a man who lost. It is the story of a man who won for so long that the winning itself created something no one saw coming. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes not from being sick, but from never being allowed to look sick. Magic Johnson understood that exhaustion better than almost anyone alive. From the moment he walked away from that 1991 press conference, the world assigned him a role that he never auditioned for and could never resign from. He became the survivor, the symbol, the proof that HIV was not a guaranteed ending. And with that role came an unspoken contract. You must always look fine. You must always smile that smile. You must always walk into every room like you own it, because the moment you don't, the narrative collapses, and you take a generation of hope down with you. So Magic Johnson did what any extraordinary competitor would do. He performed. Not dishonestly, not cynically, but with the same focused, relentless discipline that once made him the greatest point guard to ever run a fast break. He channeled every ounce of that athletic machinery into crafting and maintaining a public image that said, loudly and without hesitation, I am not just surviving, I am winning. And the business world rewarded him for it in ways that the basketball court never could have. Magic Johnson Enterprises became one of the most quietly powerful business empires in American history. Movie theaters in underserved urban communities, Starbucks franchises, Burger King locations, a stake in the Los Angeles Dodgers, ownership of the Los Angeles Sparks, partial ownership of the Washington Commanders, real estate developments across multiple cities. The man who was supposed to be dead by the mid-1990s had instead built a portfolio that Forbes would eventually value in the hundreds of millions, with some estimates pushing past the billion-dollar threshold when all assets were considered. And every time he stepped onto a stage, whether it was a business summit or a Lakers front office press conference or a charity gala, Magic Johnson looked exactly like what the world needed him to look like. Untouchable. But the people closest to him, the ones who saw him before the cameras turned on and after they switched off, were starting to notice things. Small things at first. The way certain mornings required more time. The way certain trips required more recovery. The way the energy that once seemed to generate itself now required careful management. Like a flame that needed deliberate tending to stay bright. Magic's inner circle has always been protective to a degree that borders on institutional. The people around him understand implicitly that their job is not just professional support, it is narrative maintenance. And for years they were extraordinarily good at it. Then came the appearance that changed everything. It was a high-profile public event, the kind Magic had attended hundreds of times before without incident. Cameras everywhere, fans reaching out for photos, the usual gravitational pull of a legend entering a room. But something was visibly different that evening, and the footage, despite the best efforts of those around him, made it onto social media before anyone could intervene. Magic moved differently. The physical confidence that had always been as much a part of his identity as his jersey number was subdued. There was a deliberateness to his movement that hadn't been there before. His responses during the brief media interaction were slower, more careful. His famous laugh arrived slightly behind the moment, like an audio track that was just a half-second out of sync with the picture. Most people scrolled past it. But the people who had been watching Magic Johnson their entire lives, the ones who knew every rhythm of his public persona, stopped. They screen-recorded it. They sent it to each other with a single question attached. Did you see this? His team moved quickly. The clearest footage was flagged. The sharpest clips quietly disappeared from the accounts of those who had shared them, and a carefully worded statement about a minor health maintenance visit was released with just enough clinical blandness to discourage follow-up questions. It worked. Mostly. But you cannot unring a bell. And the people who saw what they saw in that footage started digging, not out of malice, but out of the same kind of helpless concern that grips you when someone you've loved from a distance for your entire life suddenly looks like they might actually be mortal. What they found when they dug deeper wasn't just a bad night. It was a pattern. There is a number that Magic Johnson's doctors think about more than any other. It is not his viral load, which has been undetectable for years. It is not his CD4 count, which has remained in a range that would make most HIV specialists quietly proud of their work. It is not his cholesterol, his blood pressure, or any of the standard markers that a man in his late 60s would have monitored at an annual physical. The number his doctors think about most is 32. 32 years of continuous antiretroviral therapy. Because here is the medical reality that the feel-good survival narrative has always glossed over. The human body was not designed to process decades of powerful pharmaceutical intervention without consequence. The drugs that keep the HIV virus suppressed are, by their very nature, aggressive. They work by interfering with biological processes at a cellular level. And while modern formulations have become significantly more refined than the cocktail's magic was taking in the early 1990s, the cumulative impact of that length of treatment on the kidneys, the liver, the cardiovascular system, and the neurological architecture of the brain is something that medicine is still learning to fully quantify. Long-term HIV survivors, and there are far fewer of them than most people realize, are presenting in their 60s and 70s with what researchers have begun calling accelerated aging syndrome. The body of a long-term HIV survivor who has been on sustained treatment for 3 or more decades can exhibit cellular aging markers that are 10 to 15 years ahead of their chronological age. Bone density loss, cardiovascular complications, neurocognitive changes, kidney stress. These are not hypothetical risks. These are documented, peer-reviewed, clinical realities showing up in the small but growing population of people who, like magic, survived long enough for science to study what survival actually costs. Magic Johnson at 67 may, biologically speaking, be carrying a body that is navigating the physical challenges of a man in his late 70s or early 80s. And then the footage surfaced. It wasn't a red carpet moment or a formal press appearance. It was candid, the kind of footage that exists because smartphones are everywhere and not every camera can be controlled. Magic was captured at what appeared to be a semi-private gathering, seated in a way that felt unusual for a man who has always commanded a room standing up. His movements getting up from the chair were labored in a way that no camera angle could soften. The fluidity that was once so natural it seemed almost supernatural, the same physical grace that made him one of the most watchable athletes in the history of sport, was noticeably, undeniably absent. The clip was short, maybe 40 seconds. It didn't matter. 40 seconds was enough. Within hours, the comment sections across every major sports and entertainment platform were flooded. Not with cruelty, which is what you might expect from the darker corners of the internet, but with something more unsettling. Grief. The kind of anticipatory grief that arrives when the world suddenly registers that someone it has taken for granted as permanent might not be. He looks so different. This broke my heart. Please tell me he's okay. I'm not ready for this. Magic Johnson has survived longer with HIV than virtually any high-profile public figure in history. That survival has been so complete, so seemingly effortless in its public presentation, that an entire generation grew up treating it as a permanent condition rather than an ongoing battle. He became so good at living that people forgot he was fighting. That 40-second clip reminded them. And what made it even more difficult to watch, for those who understood the full context, was the timing of it. This was supposed to be a celebratory year for the Johnson family. Milestones were being planned. Events were being organized. There were talks of a documentary retrospective, a celebration of 3 decades of survival that would have been, by any reasonable measure, one of the most extraordinary human interest stories in modern sports history. Instead, the family quietly began canceling commitments. Public appearances were rescheduled and then not rescheduled. The social media presence that Magic and his team had maintained with clockwork regularity began showing gaps. Days without posts, then nearly a week, then longer silences that felt increasingly loud. And then came the hospital visits. Not announced, not explained, just observed by the kind of attentive, concerned fans who notice when the man they followed for 40 years suddenly stops showing up. The visits were quiet. The exits were through side doors. But the questions they left behind were anything but quiet. And those questions landed directly in the lap of the one person who has always known more about Magic Johnson's real condition than anyone else on Earth. If you want to understand Magic Johnson's survival, you cannot start with his doctors. You have to start with Cookie. Irvin Johnson III Cookie has been the most underwritten character in one of the most extraordinary medical survival stories in modern history. She has been present for every single chapter of it. Every dosage adjustment, every specialist consultation, every morning when the weight of what they were living through settled over the house before either of them spoke a word. She has been, by every account from those close to the family, Not just a supportive spouse but an active, informed, and fiercely protective partner in the most literal medical sense of the term. When Magic announced his diagnosis in 1991, Cookie was pregnant with their son Irvin III. She was tested immediately. She was negative. And rather than stepping back, rather than making the choice that many people in her position might have quietly justified, she stepped forward. Into the hospitals, into the research, into the pharmaceutical conversations that most spouses leave entirely to the medical professionals. Cookie Johnson became, over the years, one of the most knowledgeable non-medical voices in her husband's treatment journey. She learned the drug names. She tracked the side effects. She noticed the things that Magic, in his relentless forward momentum, sometimes chose not to notice. And she made him pay attention. People close to the family describe a dynamic that is equal parts love story and medical partnership. Cookie is the one who pushed for second opinions when the first ones felt too comfortable. Cookie is the one who adjusted the household, the diet, the schedule, the social commitments, the travel load when she felt the balance shifting. Cookie is the one who, more than any publicist or business manager, has controlled the single most important variable in Magic Johnson's life: his energy. But in the last 6 months, something shifted in that dynamic in a way that even Cookie's formidable management skills could not fully absorb. The lifestyle changes began quietly, the way the most significant changes always do. The Johnson household, which had operated for years with a certain level of structured social activity, dinners, events, public commitments woven into the fabric of their weekly lives, pulled back. Not dramatically at first. A dinner declined here. A public appearance delegated there. But the pattern accumulated into something undeniable. Magic Johnson was retreating from the life he had built, and Cookie was engineering that retreat with the same quiet precision she had applied to everything else. The travel stopped almost entirely. For a man who had been on planes more weeks than not for the better part of 3 decades, flying to business meetings, sports events, speaking engagements, charity functions across the country and around the world, the grounding was startling to those who knew his schedule. And then came the news that the family had been sitting with in private, the piece of information that recontextualized everything that had been happening in plain sight. A new diagnosis, separate from HIV, unrelated to the virus that the world has always associated with Magic Johnson's health story, but intimately connected to the way he has lived in the 30-plus years since that 1991 press conference. The details have been kept tightly within the family's inner circle. But what sources close to the situation have described carefully with obvious loyalty to the Johnsons is a cardiovascular complication of a severity that reframed his doctor's entire approach to his ongoing care. The decades of pharmaceutical management, the physiological stress of sustained treatment, combined with the high-intensity lifestyle Magic maintained throughout his business empire years, had been placing a burden on his heart that routine monitoring had flagged incrementally but that had now, at 67, crystallized into something requiring immediate and significant medical attention. Cookie reportedly received the news first. She sat with it for 2 days before she told Magic. Those who know her say that those 2 days were spent not in denial or despair, but in research. She arrived at the conversation with Magic already armed with specialist recommendations, dietary protocols, and a revised schedule that she had drafted herself. Because that is who Cookie Johnson is. But even she, even the woman who has outmaneuvered fear at every previous turn, could not prepare either of them for what the doctors said next. In the age of social media, silence is never just silence. For someone like Magic Johnson, a man whose Instagram presence had become as reliable and recognizable as his smile, a man who posted with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loved sharing his life with the world, an unexplained absence from the digital space is the loudest possible alarm bell. And the absences started stacking up in a way that could no longer be explained by a busy schedule or a vacation or a simple desire for privacy. It began with the posts. Magic Johnson's social media accounts, across platforms, had maintained a rhythm for years. Game commentary, business announcements, family celebrations, the occasional throwback photograph that would send the internet into a wave of nostalgia. His engagement with fans was authentic and consistent, the digital extension of the same magnetic accessibility that had defined his public persona since his rookie year with the Lakers in 1979. Then, over a period of several weeks, that rhythm broke. Not all at once. The disappearance was gradual enough that most casual followers didn't register it consciously. They just noticed, somewhere in the back of their awareness, that they hadn't seen Magic's face in their feed for a while. But for the dedicated followers, the ones who had been tracking the subtle changes in his public presence since that viral 40-second clip, the silence was deafening. What made it more unsettling was what had been deleted. Several posts that Magic had published, and that fans had screenshot and saved before they disappeared, were quietly removed from his accounts. The content of those posts was not controversial in any obvious way. They were not inflammatory statements or business announcements gone wrong. They were personal, reflective, the kind of posts that a man writes when he is processing something significant internally and reaches, almost involuntarily, for the act of sharing before pulling back and thinking better of it. One in particular circulated widely among the community of fans who had been paying closest attention. It was a photograph. Magic seated in what appeared to be a private garden. Somewhere quiet, somewhere that was clearly not a public venue. He was looking away from the camera, toward something outside the frame. The caption, which several fans had captured before it was removed, read simply, "Grateful for every single day. More than you know." 5 words that would have read as entirely ordinary from almost anyone else. From Magic Johnson, in this specific context, at this specific moment in time, they hit differently. The Lakers organization, an institution that Magic has maintained a complex, evolving, and deeply emotional relationship with throughout his post-playing career, was not immune to the ripple effects of what was happening. Sources within the organization described an atmosphere of quiet concern that had been building for months. Magic's advisory role, his ambassadorial presence, his gravitational pull within the franchise's identity. All of it had become conspicuously less active in ways that front office staff had noticed but nobody was putting into an official memo. And then came the meeting. It was described by those aware of it as an emergency session, though the word emergency was carefully avoided in any official communication surrounding it. Key figures within Magic Johnson Enterprises gathered, not for a scheduled quarterly review, not for a planned strategic discussion, but for a conversation that had been called with unusual urgency and that centered, according to those with knowledge of its content, on the continuity of Magic's business interests. Succession planning language was used. Asset management protocols were reviewed. The kind of conversations that healthy, thriving business leaders simply do not have at 67 unless something has fundamentally shifted in their understanding of their own timeline. The people in that room left it differently than they entered. Several of them, by multiple accounts, were visibly shaken, not because the information they received was entirely unexpected, but because hearing it stated plainly in a conference room in the language of business continuity rather than medical optimism made it real in a way that rumor and speculation never quite had. Magic Johnson was not just managing a health challenge. He was managing an ending, not necessarily an imminent one. Not a door that had already closed, but a horizon that had come into view with a clarity and a proximity that demanded the kind of practical, unsentimental preparation that Magic Johnson, the survivor, had never previously allowed himself to engage in. Because engaging in it meant admitting something. And Magic Johnson had spent 32 years refusing to admit that anything could stop him. The fact that he was now sitting in rooms where that admission was being made quietly in the language of asset protection and business succession, that was the detail that made the people who loved him most feel the ground shift beneath their feet. But none of that, not the deleted posts, not the canceled appearances, not the emergency business meeting, could prepare anyone for what Magic himself said when he finally broke his silence. There is a specific kind of courage that has nothing to do with competition. Magic Johnson has displayed the competitive kind his entire life. The courage to take the last shot. The courage to stand at a microphone in 1991 and tell the world something that could have destroyed him. The courage to build an empire in boardrooms that weren't designed to welcome men who looked like him. That kind of courage, the performative, forward-facing, victory-oriented kind, was always Magic's native language. But the courage required to sit in front of a camera, or across a table from someone you trust, and say "I am tired," that is a different dialect entirely. And Magic Johnson, at 67, has started speaking it. The interviews that have emerged in recent months carry a texture that is categorically different from anything Magic has given over the course of his extraordinarily public life. The bravado is not entirely gone, It is Magic Johnson, after all, and certain frequencies of his personality are simply too deeply embedded to disappear. But the armor is thinner now. The pauses are longer. The laugh, when it comes, arrives with something behind it that wasn't there before. Something that looks, to those watching carefully, remarkably like the specific exhaustion of a man who has been strong for a very long time and is quietly negotiating with himself about how much longer he can sustain it. In one recent conversation that drew significant attention from those within his circle, Magic spoke about legacy in a way that departed sharply from his usual forward-looking framework. He has always talked about legacy as something being built, an active, ongoing construction project with no completion date in sight. In this conversation, he spoke about it in the past tense. Not morbidly, not with despair, but with the quiet, settled finality of a man who has begun to review rather than project. He talked about his mother, about the specific texture of her voice when she told him she was proud of him, about moments from his childhood in Lansing, Michigan that he said he hadn't thought about in decades but that had been returning to him recently with an unusual vividness and insistence, the kind of involuntary memory retrieval that often accompanies a significant psychological shift in how a person relates to their own timeline. He talked about his children, about the things he wanted them to know that he wasn't sure he had said clearly enough, about the difference between showing someone you love them through action and provision, which Magic had always excelled at, and saying it with the kind of deliberate, unambiguous verbal directness that leaves no room for misinterpretation after you are gone. That phrase, "after you are gone," was not spoken, but it was present in every sentence around it. Insiders close to the Johnson family have confirmed what many observers suspected after watching those interviews. Magic has drafted a letter, not a legal document, not a business directive, a personal letter, addressed in its entirety to the people he loves and to the fans who have carried him through every chapter of his impossible story. The letter, by all accounts, is extraordinary. Those who are aware of its existence describe it as the most honest thing Magic Johnson has ever committed to paper. More honest than any interview, any autobiography, any press conference statement. It addresses things that his public persona never permitted him to address. Vulnerabilities he spent decades concealing. Regrets he transformed into forward momentum rather than sitting with. Gratitude of a depth and specificity that his public expressions of thankfulness, however genuine, never fully captured. He has not released it. The decision of when or whether to release it remains one of the most closely guarded questions within the Johnson family's inner circle. But the existence of the letter is not the most startling thing that insiders have revealed. The most startling thing is the phone call that preceded it. Magic Johnson, in the months before drafting that letter, reached out to someone, a specific individual, someone whose name, when connected to Magic's in this context, generates a reaction of genuine disbelief from anyone who knows the full history between them. He reached out to ask for forgiveness. To understand why that phone call matters, you have to understand what was lost. Magic Johnson and Isaiah Thomas were not simply rivals. They were, for a brief and luminous period in the 1980s, something closer to brothers. 2 point guards who recognized in each other a kind of basketball intelligence that was genuinely rare. The ability to see the game 3 moves ahead, to orchestrate rather than simply execute, to make everyone around them better by the sheer gravitational force of their presence on the court. They called each other before games. They embraced at center court in a way that scandalized the purists who believed that competitors should maintain clean emotional distance. Their friendship was real, documented, and widely observed. And then it ended. The fracture happened across multiple pressure points, the 1992 Dream Team selection process, during which Thomas was famously excluded in circumstances that have never been fully or satisfactorily explained publicly, with Magic's influence widely cited as a significant factor in that exclusion. The wound never healed. The two men spent decades in the same basketball universe, orbiting each other at a careful distance, their history present in every room they both occupied but never directly addressed. Until the phone call. Those with knowledge of the conversation describe it as brief by the standards of what it contained. Magic did not offer elaborate explanation or extensive justification. He did not relitigate the Dream Team decision or attempt to reframe the history between them. He acknowledged the pain that his actions had caused, and he asked, simply, directly, without the protective scaffolding of public relations language, for forgiveness. Isaiah Thomas, by all accounts, was not prepared for the call. He took it anyway. What happened in the minutes that followed is known only to the two men who were present for it. But those close to Thomas have described him as visibly moved in the days afterward, quieter than usual, reflective in a way that people who know him well recognized as significant. Whatever was said in that conversation, it landed. And it landed because of what both men understood, without stating it explicitly, about why the call was happening now. At 67, after 32 years of survival and silence, Magic Johnson was not calling to settle a score or to rehabilitate a narrative. He was calling because the horizon had come close enough that the things left undone had begun to feel genuinely urgent. And a friendship, a real one, the kind that formed in the crucible of shared greatness and was destroyed by the machinery of competition and politics, was one of the things he had left undone. Which brings us to today. The viral photographs that inspired the title of this video, the images that have circulated across social media with captions expressing shock, grief, and deep concern, tell a story that is simultaneously more complicated and more human than the headlines suggest. Magic Johnson at 67 does not look like Magic Johnson at 40. That is true. The physical transformation is real, and it is visible, and pretending otherwise would be a disservice to the honesty that this story demands. The man in those recent images carries the unmistakable evidence of a body that has fought an extraordinary battle for an extraordinary length of time, and that is now, in the way of all bodies that fight long enough, beginning to show the cost of that fight in ways that no amount of determination or discipline or medical intervention can entirely conceal. But here is what the headlines miss. Here is what gets lost when an image circulates without context, when a 40-second clip becomes a data point in a grief spiral rather than a chapter in a larger story. The man in those photographs is still here. At 67 years old, having lived for 32 years beyond a diagnosis that was handed to him like a verdict, Magic Johnson is still waking up every morning in the house he shares with Cookie. He is still calling his children. He is still, quietly, privately, away from the cameras that once defined his existence, engaged with the world in the ways that matter most to him now. The documentary that was planned as a celebration has been restructured. It is no longer a retrospective. It has become something more immediate, more intimate, more honest than any film Magic Johnson has previously allowed about his life. The cameras are being let into spaces that have always been closed. The conversations being recorded are the ones that the armor previously prevented. Magic Johnson is, for the first time in his public life, allowing the full picture to be seen. Not the survivor, not the billionaire, not the symbol, the man. And the man, tired, transformed, tender in ways that 30 years of performance never permitted, is more extraordinary than any version of Magic Johnson the world has previously been given access to. The letter exists. The phone call happened. The documentary is coming. And when it arrives, the moment that will stop every single viewer in their tracks is not a revelation about his health, or his business empire, or even the dream team. It is a single, unscripted moment captured on camera during a private family dinner. A moment that Magic did not know was being filmed, in which he says something so quietly, so without performance or intention, that it reframes every chapter of his story that came before it. It is the most human thing he has ever said. And it will make you understand, perhaps for the first time, what it actually costs to be Magic. Not Magic Johnson the legend. Magic Johnson the man. The man who ran from death for 32 years, caught it eventually in the mirror, and decided, finally, peacefully, on his own terms, to stop running and simply live whatever time remained with the fullness and the honesty that survival had sometimes, paradoxically, made harder to access. That is what happened to Magic Johnson at 67. Not an ending. A transformation. The most important one of his life. The person he called was Isaiah Thomas. As the cameras stop rolling and the public events end, a single, leaked audio clip from a private family gathering has surfaced, capturing Magic Johnson saying something so final, so devastating, that it changes the meaning of his entire 30-year survival story. What did he admit to his family when he thought no one was listening, and why does it make his recent public appearances so much harder to watch?